Oh, thank you very much, Mel, for that introduction. I've got to say that I don't know if it was a good thing or a bad thing to get the gig after lunch but before the dinner, but it's definitely a good thing to get the gig before Sean, because I would not want to have to follow the brother. Although I'm sure that there are some routines that I think we worked on together. So, of course, as is our custom, I want to particularly, as a Cook-Yalanji woman, acknowledge the traditional lands of the Gadigal people where we meet today, and pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. For me, part of the presentation this afternoon is going to be a discussion about Indigenous governance and excellence, probably to dispel some of the myths about the risk associated with Indigenous peoples and governance, but also to kind of prompt your thinking about what we need to do better as communities and as nations to increase our capacity for our Indigenous governance excellence and the sustainability for our people. As you heard in my introduction, I have been very privileged to work in a number of different sectors, but most recently spent a bit of time in the United States, Canada and New Zealand working with First Nations people over there on issues of self-government and self-determination, and I'm going to share some of those insights with you today. So part of the presentation also will be, I guess, not necessarily focusing on your sector specifically, but certainly thinking about what are the complex nature of our communities and our societies, and also how we might change the way we approach governance and working with each other to build a sustainable future. One of the pieces of work that I've been fortunate enough to do is participate in the Indigenous Governance Awards over the last couple of years. And before I get into the main part of the presentation, I wanted to share with you a little bit of a video that we made after the last session of the Indigenous Governance Awards, which gives you a little bit of insight into what we think when we're talking around Indigenous governance and why it's important for us as Indigenous peoples to respect that. So hopefully technology will be my friend. There we go. So as you can see, it's really about thinking differently about the way we talk about governance. And the group that joined me yesterday, I got them all to walk out of the room and to come back in and to start a conversation as if it was the start of the day. And one of the particular things that we do as Indigenous people is that we work out who we are, who our mob is, where we're from, to create some of that connection and those relationships. And the other important part to that is things like welcome and acknowledgement to country. And when we put a different lens on that, we realise that some of those things are absolutely crucial to governance, that they're the way that we've been practising governance for our entire lives. And if you think about that as systems and processes that help to steer societies and organisations, then that's really what governance is. We've been told, and as you saw in the video, we've been told that actually we have to comply with a different model. And I think that what we've found over many years is that Indigenous people have struggled to fit our cultural beliefs and our understandings and our practices into that imposed model of governance. So what we're doing in Australia now is starting to have different conversations about reharnessing our cultural ways of being to improve our sustainability and the benefit of our mob. So the Australian Indigenous Governance Institute has been around for a few years and is really modelled on the idea of some of the First Nations groups across the world that have been practising self-determination and self-government for generations. And as we know in Australian history, certainly in the 70s and 80s, there was a huge influx of Aboriginal organisations. But in many ways, those Aboriginal organisations merely became service delivery points for government agendas. And so how do we start to change the conversation in Australia of one that is about us as Indigenous people, setting the priorities and thinking about our cultural governance in a different way? So one of the pieces of work that the Australian Indigenous Governance Institute is doing is to undertake a whole bunch of research in Australia to get some of that evidence about what we do well. And of course the IGAs is a great source of recognising how our people do that brilliantly. But also creating practical tools and resources to enable people to use that in your own workplaces, communities and nations. Now, for many people, the idea of cultural governance is multifaceted. But one of the things that we have to think about is, what does that look like for us as we think about what we bring to the table? And really importantly, I want to test your thinking that this is not about blackfellas doing whitefella governance. This is about blackfellas doing blackfella governance. Doing things our way, setting our own priorities. But in order for us to do that, this is the stuff that we bring to the table. And for each of us in our own diversity, as we look at that wheel, we have very different values and belief systems, different knowledges and laws, and different ways that we approach things. But what we do know is that each of those things have to fit with the community and the nation that we're in. And that hierarchical model that seems so dominant in Western societies is not really the one that Indigenous people work the best at. And even if you think about knowledge holders and the way in which decision makers are selected in our communities, that in itself is part of this Indigenous cultural governance model. So one of the things that we're starting to embrace in a conversation in Australia is this idea of nation building. So as Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, we've become recognised as a homogenous group under that sort of terminology, but really what we know is the diversity of our mob is absolutely important. And for many of us, we've started to move away from our communities and nations that we come from, but we want to make that reconnection and we want to do things that help to redevelop our people in these communities. So the concept of nation building is one that I think is going to change the way we do business in Australia, but is only as strong as the conversations that we're willing to have, both with each other, but more broadly with the rest of our community. So under nation building, there's 5 particular concepts that underpin the purpose of nation building. And that's, of course, the fact that sovereignty is one of the critical parts to the participation of its people. To think about the institutions that you create as part of that nation and how you select the individuals who run that. Discussions around cultural match, and I'll talk about that a little bit further. To have some strategic approach to what you want to do as a nation, and then, of course, the critical conversation of leadership. And yesterday, when I ran the workshop, we had it about leadership and governance because I absolutely believe that those two things have to work together in order to be effective. So as you have a look across the world, I know this is not the best slide at all, but it gives you a bit of an insight into where we sit in Australia about our current status and our capacity to work as sovereign nations and to pursue self-determination. So in many of the other countries, United States, Canada and New Zealand, you can see that they've got some level of jurisdiction over those particular issues. And in Australia, these things are very much lacking. So the question for us is, how do we start to have a different perspective on some of these issues? Even the conversations around economic capacity, we are seeing things change quite significantly in the conversations around Indigenous business and how that's growing substantially. That we are starting to have treaty conversations in different states and territories because we're not waiting for the conversation to happen at a national level. But again, it goes back to that question of, are we just merely creating institutions that become service delivery points for government and a government agenda, or are we actually thinking about the way that we want to do our business differently? So in a nation building context, all of these things have to come together to build sustainability. And, you know, one of the things that Indigenous peoples talk about is our innate connection to the generations that have gone before us and the generations that go after us. And if I use one of the Pueblo insights, they say, you know, what does this look like for the decisions you make today that will affect the next 6 generations of your family and your community? So that takes us to a really important point about we can't wait another 10 years or 20 years to have some of these critical conversations, because as we know, the world continues to evolve around us, and if we don't sort of change our approach to these things, we'll find ourselves left behind. I went to a conference last year. It was a conference that suggested that the topic was progressive, and that the intent of the conference was to envisage an Australia in 2050. And they showed all of these videos at the start of the conference about how far we'd come, with images of, you know, the 1960s housewife and the man going off to work and the woman staying at home with really bad household products and aprons and all of those kind of horrendous things that we look back on and say, oh, I'm so glad we don't live there now. But none of you would be surprised to realise that even in all of that footage, there was not one skerrick of imagery that represented Indigenous peoples. So being the shy individual that I am, I had to point that out to them. And I said to them that you've already made your first mistake. And they said, what do you mean by that? And I said, because if you are here talking about an Australia and the future of Australia, the invisibility or the marginalisation of Indigenous people in that conversation is your first mistake. Because over the next 20 to 30 years, you will absolutely see our position change. It will change legally and politically and socially. And if you think that the Australia you build now doesn't have to factor that in, I think you're going to find yourself in a really difficult place, particularly as we start to think about treaties and those conversations around partnership and development and exercising our rights. And ultimately, that's what it has to be. We all know about the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People, but again, it's only as powerful as the action that supports it. So I've been thinking about how you change the conversation in Australia, and I reflect back on the time I had in the United States where I was talking with a number of different nations about what is it that encourages people to make change. Because I don't know about you, mob, but some of our mob are the worst people to try and take on a journey of change. They don't like it, they're resistant to it, and they're happy with the status quo. But pretty much we've all got something to say about what we don't like, what's not happening in our communities, where we think some of the changes need to be made, and yet then in the next breath find it very difficult to actually enact that change. So they said to me that actually research says that there is one of 4 things that has to happen in order to enact change. And that is that an opportunity arises. Seems pretty obvious, but an opportunity arises for you to harness change. You get to a position of enough already. We've been doing this for a long time, nothing's changing. At what point do we, pick up the reins and run with it? So that enough already thing is something I think I've said about 50 times in my career. We either are faced with crisis, that actually forces us to change, or somebody has a visionary position. Now, one of those 4 things has to happen. Preferably, the crisis is the least of them that you want to happen, but we ultimately know that sometimes it takes something really big to change the way our mob act and behave, but also to get everybody on the same page. So I thought about this in terms of the presentation and how that might help you, as I said, in your sector, but in your communities, in your nations, and in a whole range of other ways. But making that change is the absolute critical part to understanding who we want to be. And that's one of the first questions I think we have to ask ourselves, is what do we picture for our future? Where do our communities and nations want to be in 50 and 100 years? And how do we start to put things in place now that help that? So as you'll see here, I've talked a little bit about, so these are the 4 things that I believe are critical to that change. We've got to change the conversation, change the behaviour, change our institutions, and change our relationships. So what do I mean by changing the conversation? I'm sure that as all of you work in the health sector, you're very familiar with the deficit discourse that surrounds Indigenous peoples. The stats tell the story of disadvantage and disproportion and are absolutely framed in that deficit all the time. So we have to start to contest those statistics and the way that they're presented. And if anybody knows the work of the Data Sovereignty Network in Australia, and particularly people like Ray Lovett, you know, the conversations that say 25% of all Indigenous people under the age of 25 are living in low socioeconomic housing and are subjected to domestic violence. That's a story we've all heard, right? The other part to that story is that 75% of our children under the age of 25 are not living in low socioeconomic housing and are not subjected to violence. But the story that is constantly told about us is the one in the deficit, and is almost the one that as Indigenous people we've started to claim as our own. So how do we start to encourage our own mob to dream differently, to talk out loud about the things that are untrue about us? Those deficit conversations are not our story, and they're not the ones that we should champion ourselves. We should champion the positivity and the things that we do absolutely fundamentally well. The fact that all of you are here is a demonstration of the commitment of our mob to work with our mob to see positive change. And so I think part of it is putting it into the universe that says, no, every time we hear one of our mob talk like that, let's ask them about what the other side of that story is. Let's think about shaping the positive conversation. How do you get the fire back in the belly for people to create that positive change in the way we talk about each other, but more importantly about how we see our own future? And that, to me, as you see on this slide, is a really critical question for us to think about around who are we and who do we want to be? What does the cultural match look like, and how does that work in practice in our governance? And just as I'd said in the opening remarks, was cultural practice in governance means what works for us. Who are the decision makers? Who are the knowledge holders on particular things? How do we consult with each other? How do we find consensus in the way we approach our decisions? And those are hard things to kind of change and, I guess, decolonise in a lot of ways, but that's really where our agenda has to sit. And the last one there that I've put there is sovereignty by stealth. So as I said to you before, I know that we don't have jurisdictions over a lot of things that our lives are impacted by. But there's a really important action that we can take in saying we can act as sovereign nations. We can reharness the power that we have as a collective, and we can start to behave that way. And when we do that, we start to gain a different momentum and a different pride and a different opportunity. One of the greatest examples of that, I reckon, is, lots of communities complain about all them government officials coming in and out of their communities all the time for consultation. And I'm kind of like, well, why you let them? And they go, well, because they're government, they give us money. I said, yeah, but what if you just said, we're only available on Thursday. Thursday's the day we'll open the doors for you fellas to come in. Every other day we got something else to do. But what we actually do is give away the power sometimes to others to define for us our own priorities. And to me, that's really part of a critical conversation for our mob. The next one is about changing the behaviour. And this is really, again, kind of harnessing that idea of identity. We do talk as a collective group, as Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, but I'm Kuki Yalanji and I'm Bachelor. And those things should also be just as powerful in my conversation. We also need to embrace the ways of knowing doing and being at the forefront of every aspect of our lives. So for many of us, we go into workplaces and we feel like we've kind of got to change who we are in that environment and in that particular workplace. And I ask the question of why. If we want authenticity in the way other people engage with us, then we also have to be doing that ourselves. And critically, I think the other thing is, as Indigenous people, we need to champion each other. Because one of the hardest things and the hardest lessons that we've had to see is that our own mob tear us down. And we have to stop that behaviour because we have to be this collective force. And I wanted to just talk here about, that question of changing behaviour and perspective. You'll see that middle photo there is actually a photo from the Warlpiri Education and Training Trust. And that's a representation of a group of women in that community who receive substantial royalties from a gold mine very close to their country. But what was happening in those communities is the dispersion of royalties money goes to families, right? And most of the time those families all go off to some other community and spend their money. And nothing comes back in to their home community. So these ladies in Warlpiri said, no, we want that money to go back to our kids. So we want a substantial amount of royalties to go back into this fund that supports our kids to do all of these things. And what that painting represents is taking the kids on bush camps, the preservation of language. There's not too many Aboriginal paintings with an aeroplane in it, but this one's got one. Because what they want to do is take their kids on excursions to different parts of the country and to see different things, to provide them scholarships and opportunities for further employment and engagement. And it was a long journey for those women. Lots of resistance and in fact lots of violence perpetrated against them because they dared to ask the question. But their perseverance got them to a point where finally someone understood what their story was. And the investment in the kids has been incredible. And the Warlpiri were the winners of the Indigenous Governance Awards Category B last year because what they could demonstrate to us is even despite the fact that government took away funding for language programs in schools in the Northern Territory, they funded it themselves. They've got Warlpiri teachers teaching their language at every aspect of schooling for their kids. So this is the power in changing the behaviour and the perspective that we have. And the other one there is the Culture, Integrity and Investment Framework that was developed by IUI. And I particularly wanted to mention IUI because what happened, they participated in the Indigenous Governance Awards a couple of years ago, got some feedback from the judges, and they went back and considered that feedback and then tried to implement change based on that. And one of those issues was about how do you create cultural integrity in an urban environment? How do you get people to engage in this space and trust in what you're doing and find some collective voice? So through a very difficult and complex process, they got to a point where they developed this framework and that they, have really seen change in the way that people are engaging with the service. And I'm sure you all know the many different examples of the work that they do. The next one is about changing the institutions. And as I said, the Declaration of Rights says that we are absolutely entitled as Indigenous peoples to self-determination, to create institutions that represent us, to have representatives make decisions on our behalf, and to choose the way that those institutions work. And here is just a couple of examples of how I think we're starting to do that. So the nation-building leadership relates to the third logo on the left-hand side, and that's a flag of the Ngarrindjeri Nation. And the Ngarrindjeri Nation has been practicing those concepts of nation building for a long period of time. And what they've been able to do is substantiate a position that even without native title, they now are in a position of negotiation with the state government on a government-to-government basis. So they are saying they are an Aboriginal government unto themselves, and you have to develop relationships and partnerships with us on an equal status. Creating opportunities for economic development, of course, is the supply nation conversation that says, you know, we've gone from 1,000 to 2,500 Indigenous businesses over the last 10 years. And in particular, I like the slogan, they just celebrated their 10-year anniversary, and the slogan was, we're no longer the job takers, but the job makers. And I think that's a really powerful place to say we're no longer the recipients of welfare and dependency, but we're actually creating our own economies and our futures. Exercising our power and opportunity is also a conversation around how you do things differently. And for too long, we've relied on government to be the supplier of that. And the 10 Deserts project is a great example of how people have said, because we got into crisis and the government took money away from our ranger program, the 10 desert groups came together and they said, we still want to protect country. We still want to do all of those things that increase the well-being of our people on country. That we need to think about how we sustain the future of that, and went out and sourced different funding from groups like philanthropic groups, and of course are now running this project that's going to protect a third of the Australian continent, run by Indigenous peoples, using Indigenous knowledges and philosophies on the protection of those lands. And of course, what do you reckon government did once it saw this great project? It said, oh, we want a piece of that. And they said, no, thank you. We're right. And there's such a power in being able to do that, in that self-determination conversation. And then, of course, the conversation of succession planning is an important one. And I asked the group yesterday whether anybody was interested in standing for a position on a board. Most people said no, but then I heard maybe later that they had time to think about it and went, oh, yeah, that's something I'd like to do, but I need to start thinking about the skills that I have to get in order to participate in that. But to remind ourselves that we actually have some of these skills, we've been participating in it in our own communities for generations. And then finally is the conversation about changing the vision and the relationships that we have. For me, the critical conversation in this, I actually believe, starts with us. And many of you would be familiar with the work that's happening across the country around the Uluru Statement, the Voice to Parliament and the Makarrata Commission on Treaty Negotiations, and of course the truth-telling. And what I've said in many occasions is that the other things take substantial time, systemic and institutional change. The one thing that doesn't is truth-telling. Truth-telling is the thing that we can do right now, in every place that we are. And some of that even is in our own families. You know how we all got mob that don't talk to another mob, but they can't actually tell you why they don't talk to that mob, because it's just how it's always been. So we need to start to have those yarns with our mob and say, okay, well, let's talk about this stuff. Let's work out a way to do this better. But importantly, as we think about moving forward, are our nations and our communities actually ready and mature enough to accept what happens next? And I think about that in terms of treaty and saying, if you get treaty, what happens the next day? Are we ready? And so all of these things, as I've said, you know, are about community and about nations, but they actually play out in all of your workplaces and in all of those different spaces that you have influence and opportunity. And I guess the powerful part in it is to say that if we consciously think about changing the narrative about our people that comes from our voice and is set by us, then I think it builds a much more sustainable community for us in the future. And that in 50 years' time, we no longer rely on government and others to dictate to us the intent or the purpose by which we exist. And finally, I just wanted to say thank you very much for the invitation to come along and present, and hopefully that's been useful to you. And that I've left some material about the Governance Institute out on one of the tables outside. But I guess I'd like to say, just in closing, my question to you is, what's your part in this? How do you embrace the opportunities, and how will you be the person that drives change in that positive way for the next 10 to 20 years? Thanks very much.